Hello, friends. Hope everyone is doing fantastic. I hope that you've been following along in my reading of my book. And today we are on chapter 3. If you haven't listened to the first two chapters, you can go back and do that first and then continue on here with chapter 3. And I'm just going to hop in here and read chapter number 3 of Pioneering Alaska from a Child's Perspective. In chapter number 3, I've titled Dreams, Dogs, and the Iditarod. In the last chapter, I mentioned that we got some dogs. So when I say we got some dogs, I don't mean we got just 2 or 3. I mean we got a lot of dogs, from 25 to at times 50 or more. Why, you might ask? Why so many dogs? Well, someone got the Iditarod fever along with the pioneering fever. What is the Iditarod? It's the long-distance 1,049-mile dog sled race from Anchorage to Nome, Alaska. And for some reason, my dad thought it would be a great idea. And it seems that we were along for another crazy adventure. I don't remember when we first got the dogs. We only had one in our home as a pet. The dog team was kept out of town at a dog kennel until we moved out of Anchorage. I remember the nightly trips to the kennel and the 5-gallon buckets of prepared dog food. The smell of wet dog food permeated the blazer, and food sloshed out of the buckets as my older siblings and I held tightly, trying to keep them from tipping and spilling their contents as we bounced and jiggled down a bumpy road to the kennel. When we moved to the valley, the dogs were kept in the backyard or side yard. They were moved around some due to muddy wet seasons that didn't allow for a proper bedding spot for them. I remember out beyond the outhouse was what was called the dog lot, where all the dogs were kept. Each dog had its own space. Its chain was secured to a metal post, most often an old car axle pounded into the ground. The dogs would circle their space as far as their chain would reach, creating a worn-out circle of earth. They would dig holes in the summer and make themselves a cool spot to lie. They would have to do their dirty business in their space also. Most often, they would choose one spot and make it the spot. Occasionally, you would have the ones that would just dirty around the entire perimeter of their space, each to their own. It just made cleaning up the poop, or what my mom called dog dirt, more interesting. Most of the dogs had a really cool doghouse. I'm not sure where my dad got them, but it seemed that most of the dogs didn't use them. So my little brother and I would use them as playhouses. I guess the dogs didn't mind. The houses had a hallway of sorts, and then a turn to the right, over a short partition, and into a dark, tiny room. The roof was slanted quite a bit, so that the rain and snow would slide off the back, but I could stand in the tallest part. I'm not sure why the dogs didn't like it, but I remember feeling a bit claustrophobic and a bit vulnerable, with there only being one way out. Maybe those feelings were mutual. I remember the nightly serenade each evening at the same time. I'm not sure how they could tell the time, but somehow they knew. One of them starts the serenade. I'm not sure if it was the same dog every night or they took turns, but once they started, they would all break out into a beautiful goodnight howl, thanking their owner and maybe even their creator for another lovely day. Most often, the serenade would continue throughout the neighborhood as the neighbors' dog teams would begin their serenade in turn. We never had complaints about the howling, but the barking at mealtime and runtime was something altogether different. The dogs would begin barking when my dad would start his walk to the dog lot with the 5-gallon buckets in hand. Each dog had 2 number 10 tin cans. You know, the large ones that you get coffee or bulk foods in. They were nailed to their dog houses because if you didn't attach it to something, the moment you walked away, they spilled the contents all over the ground. They each had a can for water and a can for food. Feeding these dogs was a little more than just giving your pet a scoop of dry food. There were many buckets of food, and these were working dogs, being trained to run long distance. So they had food additives and supplements, cooked foods, and fats added. It was a daily process to feed them. Fortunately, that was not my job, but sometimes their food smelled mighty good. As each one received their food, the barking got lesser and lesser until the last one had been fed, and then there was silence as they settled in for the evening with full stomachs and happy hearts. Having a dog team was more than just feeding and cleaning up the dog dirt. There was a lot more to having a dog team. They needed to be trained, and that was quite a chore. Not one that I had anything to do with, but nevertheless, it took a lot of time, and it took a lot of time away from the family. When it was time to take the dogs on their daily training runs, the barking would begin, each dog excited and hopeful that they would get their turn to run that day. The sled was readied and the lines laid out, the harnesses chosen for those that would run that day, and the musher completely ready, for there wouldn't be a chance to grab forgotten items once the dogs were hooked to the sled. The dogs would be selected and brought to the line, harnesses put on, and the dogs placed in their running positions. I remember my dad harnessing up the dogs, knowing just how to stand and handle them to get their heads and feet in harness, and then they would be hooked up to the sled in an order that I wouldn't figure out for many years. There were lead dogs, swing dogs, team dogs, and wheel dogs. The leaders obviously led the team and set the pace. They learned commands like G, right turn, and HA, left turn. The lead dog had the responsibility to keep the gang line, the line that runs from the leader to the sled, tight. They would use their senses, smell and feel, to find the trail when the snow had covered up previous trail markings and footprints. The lead dog, or dogs, had a trusting bond with their musher, and vice versa. The swing dogs were positioned directly behind the leader, or leaders. They helped to steer the team around the corners as the lead dog makes a turn. It is not uncommon for the team to want to just follow. The swing dogs pull the team in an arc that keeps the other dogs on the trail and brings the sled and musher around the corner safely. The team dogs are the team's strength. They pull the sled and maintain speed. There are several pairs of team dogs, and they are capable of pulling between 300 to 500 pounds. Wheel dogs are the dogs closest to the sled. They are typically the biggest dogs because they are first to take on the weight of the load during starts and climbs. Dogs don't always stay in one position. It depends on the day, the terrain, and the dog's temperament that day. I don't know how my dad learned where to put each dog and all the technical stuff, but he did, and it worked, and he enjoyed mushing the dogs as often as he could. I remember the excitement of the dogs barking and jumping until the moment the snow hook was released and the musher yelled, "Hike," or "mush." The team fell silent as they put their energy into pulling the sled across the snow into the wilderness, and those dogs left behind silenced, knowing today was not their day. The feeling you got as the dogs pulled the sled over the freshly fallen snow can be described as exhilarating, with a deep connection to nature. The soft, whooshing sound of the snow beneath the runners and the rhythmic panting of the dogs creates a unique soundtrack that enhances the experience. The pristine, untouched snow glistens in the sunlight, creating a breathtaking landscape. As the dogs surge forward, you feel a rush of adrenaline and joy. The power and enthusiasm of the dogs is infectious, and you can't help but feel their excitement. There is a profound sense of partnership with the dogs. You're not just the musher, you are part of the team. The shared goal of moving together through the snowy landscape fosters a deep bond. My mom had a part in all of it also. She did mush the dogs on occasion, but the dream of running the race to Nome was not one of hers. But she would diligently support my dad in his dream. I remember the multitude of hours and the late nights she spent by lantern light at the old treadle Singer sewing machine as she made dog booties and dog harnesses. Each stitch was a pedal on the treadle, the thick webbing material sewn together, each harness carefully measured to fit a specific dog. The padding on the harness gave each dog comfort at its pressure point, and a metal D-ring to attach the snaps to the gangline. There were many details that went into designing the most functional, comfortable, and durable harnesses that would withstand the harsh outdoor weather. The booties. Oh, so many booties. 16 dogs with 4 feet each, plus they would lose a few each time they went out for a run. My dad would spend hours making the gang lines. The gang line is what attaches the dogs to the sled. And each dog has a neck line, which attaches to their collar, and the tug line, which is attached to the end of the dog's harness. This is where the D-ring and snap are used as a quick release for safety. My dad also built his own sleds. I remember the wood for the sleds, usually birch or ash, was brought into the cabin. It needed to be steamed over boiling water until it was able to be bent into shape. Having only wood heat to heat the water, the fire in the wood stove was kept stoked and hot until each bend was made. Each piece, from the runners to the brush bow, which is the front of the sled, the handlebar, the stanchions, the basket where the load is held, and the brake must be correctly bent and put together to make a comfortable ride for the musher and smooth pull for the dogs. There was wood measured and cut, wood sanded and varnished, holes drilled, screws, bolts, and brackets, and without the luxury of electricity, everything took a bit more time and a lot more work. My parents were a good team as they worked together to accomplish the life they dreamed of. They eventually started selling full team harnesses, lines, and booties to other mushers. They had a good little business and kept themselves busy during the cold, dark winters. To run the Iditarod would take a lot of work and money. Besides the dogs, the musher, and the sled, there was so much more. There was the dedication and discipline of taking the dogs out on runs. After all, they were the athletes. They needed to be trained properly to do a long-distance race of this magnitude. They needed a strict training regimen in all kinds of weather conditions, on all kinds of days, in all ranges of temperatures. And the musher must make the sacrifices needed to be sure they got what they needed. To actually run the Iditarod race, you must sign up and pay a fee. That is when the decision to run the Iditarod gets real. Once that decision is made, the planning and organizing begins. Each musher must supply their food and food for their dogs for the entire trip, along with their nightly bedding and necessary gear, and have it shipped out to the various 23 or so checkpoints along the way from Anchorage to Nome. Each bag, labeled with its checkpoint and musher's name, was strewn throughout the cabin, being strategically filled with dog food, musher food, dry socks, headlamp batteries, extra booties, harnesses, needed gear, and the supplies needed to get musher and team to the next checkpoint safely and healthy. From Squentna to Yetna, Unalakleet and Shaktoolik, and so many more checkpoints that became household names to us during this time. The days before the race were a buzz of busyness and organization, checking and double-checking everything. As a child, I remember the excitement, but I could also feel the seriousness of it all as it got closer and closer to race day. Race day was a flurry of hurry and wait. I was always somewhere in the mix, just trying to keep up and to stay close by as to not get lost amidst the dogs, mushers, handlers, sleds, and the nervous anticipation in the air as the mushers hug and kiss their families and head off down the trail towards possibly the harshest, coldest, darkest, and most lonely weeks of their lives as they face their fears, conquer their demons, challenge themselves, and compete with the others. They will each find what they are made of when push comes to shove, when tired becomes delirium and hunger strikes, and when the dark gets darker in unknown places. The cold temperatures and wind chill can disorient and debilitate both dogs and musher. Open water crossing rivers creates either a challenge or a tragic mistake, and losing the trail can be catastrophic. Boredom and exhaustion can force dogs and or musher to give up or become sick. Emotions run deep, and you are alone to console and converse only with yourself and your Creator. The beauty of the Alaskan wilderness and monumental achievement, whether finishing in the top ranks or simply crossing the finish line, is enough to keep mushers coming back year after year and drawing new participants into its thrilling embrace. My dad attempted the Iditarod race 6 times, and successfully crossed the finish line in Nome 3 of those times. The other 3 attempts would end in a scratch from the race for complications along the trail that put him in compromising situations that he wasn't willing to take the risk of harm to his dogs or himself. One of those attempts was in 1977. I remember distinctly because our neighbor offered to fly my mom out to one of the checkpoints in his small 2-seater airplane to see my dad, and 9 months later, we added sibling number 5. And if you're keeping track, yep, it was a girl. Many years later, my oldest brother also took on the challenge and ran the Iditarod and successfully finished the race as he crossed under the burled arches in Nome, Alaska, twice. And that is the end of Chapter 3. I hope that you have enjoyed the reading of this book, and you'll come back next week for Chapter number 4.